You are listening to the Doc Malik podcast. This show is 100% independent and fully funded by listeners like yourself. So, if you wish to support Ahmed in all that he is doing, then please subscribe to his channel on Spotify or his Substack. Or simply buy him a coffee with a one-off donation, links to which can be found at docmalik.com. Now, let's get on with the show.
Good morning, Angus. Do you know it's been almost 2 years since you were on my podcast? How has time flown by?
It's amazing.
And I have to thank you. You know, that podcast, you were so candid and honest. And you had a sense of humor as well, I have to admit. So thanks. A lot has changed, hasn't it, since those 2 years?
It has. It's changed tremendously. And the biggest news, I think, is that Robert Kennedy was finally appointed. I was very worried he was not going to make it because there were so many people trying to say he shouldn't be because of all these various things and that he was an anti-vaxxer, etc. Well, I've got to know that circle very well. And he's a better scientist than most of my peers because he actually looks at the facts. He goes through it. He looks for the references. None of my scientist colleagues did that with what was going on with it. It was the origin of the virus. It was the logic of making the vaccine, the safety of the vaccines. They were all pig stupid in accepting things. And I summarise it up that Matt Ridley, who wrote with Lisa Shan, the viral, which was the history of where it came from, because he started with the fact that the virus did appear to originate in some caves about 1,000 miles from Wuhan. Very interesting story that he set out to document. And at the end of the book, he came up saying, well, it certainly didn't come from the bat. It must have come from the laboratory. And I said, and at the end of the book, he says, it's now almost certainly it came from the laboratory. And I said, well, I agree with you totally, except I would use the almost. I would take the almost out because the markers could only have been put in artificially in the laboratory. And at least 2 of them had been published by the Wuhan that they put them in successfully before. The reason I'm telling you this story was what he told me was, why the scientist just refused to look at the data. He said, in researching the book, I had a meeting with 3 fellows of the Royal Society, including the president, to discuss these very issues. And it transpired that none of them had looked at the sequence closely. And their excuse was there was no need to, because it obviously came from a bat. If that's the reaction of fellows of the Royal Society, who I might point out now include such towering intellectuals as Chris Whitty and Patrick Vallance, what are they for? I would disband them. I think they're absolutely failed completely over this. Up 100%. Statisticians, they should have reined in Neil Ferguson and his ludicrous predictions. He's never made a correct one in my life. If he has, I'd like someone to point it out. But he certainly caused chaos with foot and mouth predictions and the mad cow disease, etc. It was absolutely awful. And yet, it now transpires they used his work to justify the lockdown.
Yeah, well,
this is Robert Kennedy getting in. I think is going to be the beginning of the end of this madness, because he is actually a better scientist than anybody that I have met in this whole business, apart from my very close colleagues who I collaborate with.
I mean, I can't agree more with you. I mean, the thing is, Neil Ferguson has got every single thing wrong, every prediction, and all I see is promotion upwards. I mean, he's got a very big title, very big position at Imperial. He's respected amongst certain people and seems to get away with everything he does wrong. If I was failing like him, I'd be behind bars. And Chris Whitty can stand up and say, the decision for mandates was politically motivated. Why is he not being investigated by the GMC? He is the chief medical officer. When medical ethics were being trashed, he was pushing forward mandates knowing that it was politically motivated and not backed in science.
I think he's a disgrace who should be taken to the High Court. And all the evidence was put against him. He should be in jail. I really mean that. And I've issued many statements that he's made which prove I would say he's a moron. I now actually think he's actually worse than that, because he said things which I'll just take one statement. You must vaccinate 5-year-olds to protect their grandmothers. I mean, you don't vaccinate anybody to protect anybody else. And he said this when all the grandmothers and their parents had already been vaccinated. And it was very obvious the vaccines didn't prevent infection. So why would you put children at risk of what was then the messenger RNA vaccines only, when I and thousands of us, I mean, there's tens of thousands signed by the Hope Agreement, the Hope Accord, when we pointed out that there is a serious risk this can cause permanent DNA damage and expose the children to a dreadful carcinogenic risk. And we now know that the FDA passed all these vaccines without any carcinogenic testing, no genotoxicity testing. And I know from my experiences going into in-depth investigation in Australia and New Zealand and all the inquiries going on here, is that the regulatory agencies here, the MHRA, the TGA in Australia, they all took FDA guidance. They didn't do their job at all. The MHRA should be disbanded. It is so incompetent. After that inquiry, which we were the stage 4 of the vaccines, and the evidence given by people who have done really in-depth investigation, like Nick Hunt from the Perseus report, it is unbelievable that we aren't losing far, far more of our population due to drugs every year, because they boasted they take 11 years to remove a drug off the market, that they don't bother looking at the yellow cards, not even the fatal ones. That's what actually happened. What did it actually say? Rain says they're all investigated. I mean, they just contradicted each other all the way through. I no longer can trust any of these institution bodies. I can't trust the MHRA. We can't trust bodies like the Royal Society. I really got into trouble with the Royal College of Physicians for pointing out the position on the vaccine. Why are they accepting this? Why are they trying to punish people like me who's pointing out not only the truth, but the bleeding obvious? So we should be silenced, and that's what's going on. The same thing with the GMC, persecuting really good doctors. I've lost my faith in all these government institutions, and that's why, in a own small way, I'm really celebrating Robert Kennedy getting into that position in America, because it could just be the start of stopping the rot.
Well, I hope so. I have to say, I don't agree with your assessment about the MHRA being incompetent. I think it's malfeasance. It's too competent to be incompetent. They're consistently enabling, in their own words, Big Pharma. And this is more than just, mistakes were made. I mean, this is just, there was an agenda and it was clear. It was a script. Don't you think so?
I won't argue with that at all. Because I agree that an agency that hid behind such competency couldn't have been that incompetence without an incentive.
Yeah. And talking about GMC persecution, so a lot of doctors who spoke out against what was going on in Australia, in Canada, in America, in Britain, myself included, calling out the vaccine harms, got really into trouble. We got suspended, investigated, lost our licenses. How is it that some doctors like yourself haven't got into trouble with the GMC? And there seems to be a pattern. Those doctors that were promoting at some point the vaccines and now question it, you seem to be untouched. Whereas other doctors like me, 2 years have moved on. I was an orthopedic surgeon. This was a hobby. I've handed back my license. I've been kicked out of private hospitals. What's happening there? Have you got into any trouble in the GMC? Had the hospital censored you? And if not, why not, do you think?
Well, I've got into trouble with the hospital, with the Royal College of Physicians, a whole range of authorities. I found out that I've been reported to this Central Disinformation Unit, this CDU, which is meant to be set up for terrorists and paedophiles and etc., that when I found a colleague had been reported to it and told me how to go about looking if I'd been reported to it, I've been reported to it over 24 times. So if I'm that much of an issue, why didn't they come and talk to me and say what's going on here? No, it's just reported. And Chris Whitty reported me. I know that. I mean, outrageous. He should have called me up and let's discuss this.
Does Chris Whitty have any conflicts of interest, by the way? Because that's another big thing I keep finding.
Well, he must have. I mean, we know Patrick Vallance had loads of conflicts of interest and should never have been in that position. Chris Whitty, I'm not aware, and that's for others to find out.
Okay. So, for example, there was Andrew Pollard.
Mm.
Is that his name?
Yeah, Pollard.
Yeah, he was chair of the JCVI, but wasn't he an investigator of the COVID vaccines as well? I mean, is that not a massive conflict of interest?
That is a massive conflict of interest.
You know, because when it came to the AstraZeneca vaccine, he was the chief investigator on those trials.
Mm.
But he was also chair of the Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunization. I mean, that's a blatant conflict of interest. I mean, how can that be? How can that be going ahead? And no one calls it out.
Well, that's the way this sort of inner circle, elite, that's the way they work. And the idea that things are done on merit and the right person for the job is full of fairies in this business. And I mean, I know that from people who've gone for top jobs and don't get them, and the people who do get the top jobs. I mean, I'll tell you, once when I was at the House of Parliament, we were presenting about the vaccines, a special expert committee, which was set up and led by Andrew Brigden, he was the bravest MP of the lot. And what's happened to him? He's lost his seat. And we were going from one room to another chamber, etc. And I was talking to one of the senior people in the government administration, and I said, you know, you've got people from all over the world presenting all this evidence that the vaccines cause far more harm than good, and yet they are still pushing them out. I said, how on earth is this being allowed? How on earth can you justify having Chris Whitty as the CMO? Why haven't you got, why has he been not got rid of? And he basically leaned back in his chair and looked at me as if I just didn't get it. And he said, well, if we'd had anybody who was competent and had any probity in this job, we'd never have been able to push the vaccine programme, would we?
Who said that to you?
Senior member of the government who was following us around, probably making sure we didn't escape us. But I was absolutely staggered. Then, on another occasion, he said, I said, this. I think this was the second meeting. We had a couple of these meetings. On another occasion, the same fellow said to me, and I said, look, we've got all this evidence that there's nothing being achieved here. I said, if you give a booster vaccine, it's actually making things worse. Why is my general practice still calling me up all the time, telling me to get a booster when I pointed out they're very dangerous and they're probably committing serious physical damage? And you know what he then said? I nearly fell off the chair. He said, well, the government spent hundreds of millions on these vaccines. They're incredibly expensive, and I think they feel they ought to use them up. Again, I nearly fell off my chair. I mean, they know.
Wow. Wow.
It's unbelievable.
So Alex Creel on my podcast recently said, no one with integrity will be allowed to get to any position of authority because they need people who are compromised or incompetent. They don't like people with integrity getting to the top.
Well, I think my little anecdotes are just proven.
So just recap what this government insider said to you. The first thing about the vaccines and positions of authority. Just say that again.
Well, he said, I said, you know what? How can? Because I have openly called Chris Whitty a moron for all the stupid things he's said and done, and also, I mean, he's actually in my book. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think somebody overrides the JCVI and insists on this experimental gene therapy. It's not a vaccine. It's not even approved to go into children who never die from this disease. It's just another respiratory disease, who insists that they must have it to protect their grandparents. I think that is criminal negligence, and he should stand an answer to that. And the guy, and I said, how anybody that stupid be so high up? And his words, he said, well, if we had anybody who was, useful and had any probity and etc. in that job, we'd never have been able to push through the vaccine program. Those were the words. I mean, it was staggering.
Wow.
It's staggering. In fact, they all know. So this goes back to there's a big malfeasance going on. They all know. And they all sit back and say, well, we've got our useful idiots in place. I mean, what hope is there for us to defend our security from the Chinese and Russians when they openly admit they've got idiots in place so they can control them?
Right, I want to show you something. So this is the Lancet paper, Safety and Efficacy, Vaccine, blah, blah, SARS-CoV. And Andrew Pollard is on this. And if you go right to the bottom of the paper, this Lancet paper, like every paper, there's a, disclosure. AGP and SGC conceived the trial, is the chief investigator. Mr. Pollard is the chief investigator. He conceived it, and he's the chief investigator. And he also contributed to the protocol and design of the study. And then it talks about declarations of interest. And way down in the bottom, in the middle somewhere, it goes, AJP is a chair of the UK Department of Health and Social Care Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunisation. So he's the top dog deciding, whether these vaccines are approved or not. You've got the basically fox guarding the chicken coop, but does not participate in discussions on COVID-19 vaccines, and is also a member of the WHO's SAGE. I mean, these are massive conflicts of interest, and no one seems to be talking about it. And no one seems to get in trouble. That in itself would be a reason for him to be pulled up by the GMC. Like I said, I get referred to the GMC and get, accused of being an anti-vaxxer and a conspiracy theorist. People are blatantly doing things that are wrong, like Whitty and Pollard, breaching medical ethics.
And don't forget Patrick Vallance.
And Patrick Vallance. Well, he's not a medical doctor, is he?
Yes, he is. Oh, yes.
Is it?
He was professor of pharmacology in St. George's.
Oh, wow. And doesn't he have shares in some vaccine company or some, I don't know, there was a conflict of interest?
He was medical director of Glaxo, GSK, before he became the chief scientific officer. So he had, I don't know these facts, but I am told that he had options of around 5 million, which is the sort of thing they do get when they become senior people very, very high up. I don't know the details, etc. All I do know is that number 2 who worked for him thought he was bloody useless. So he was so useless, he was recruited to be the country's chief scientific officer.
I mean, it's just incredulous. It's incredulous. And the thing is, the words are important. Chief medical officer. I mean, I don't know about you, but that sounds like, the top dog. You've got 300,000 doctors. You're meant to be the top dog. You're meant to be representing the medical profession, upholding medical ethics, scientific, the scientific world. That's not a small title,
The buck stops with you. Now, they all say they all went along. This is their defence is the same as sheep escaping out of a field. Well, he's going, so am I. Or lemmings jumping off a cliff. Well, he went, I'll follow him. They can't do that. The buck stops with the chief medical officer. He's been responsible for all this. He is responsible, I think, for the massive... This inquiry, and then we had the People's Vaccine trial afterwards, which we went over all the stuff that they clearly missed. I mean... This job was to prevent the dreadful harm that has occurred when people like me, who'd done an enormous amount of research in it, said, at the bottom line, these vaccines will not work, they're not necessary. I only went along with it initially because it was implied they knew something I didn't. It now transpires they were lying. They actually knew far, far less than I. Because with regards to the vaccines, there's actually no justification for coronavirus vaccines whatsoever. And the reason is, as we found out, that when you get the first big wave, it's over and done with in 3 months. A warp speed vaccine takes 6 to 7 months. By the time it's made, it's of no use. because the first isolate has gone. You then, I was going to use the word impregnate, it's not far off it. You then program the immune system with a vaccine that now, because this is what happens with coronavirus vaccines, they suffer from antigenic sin or immunological imprinting. So they'll only ever see that variant, which is long gone, which means they cannot see the incoming waves. And they will react to the incoming waves, and they send up showers of useless antibodies that are so useless that they're worse than useless because they latch at the viruses, but they don't neutralize them. And what they do, they enhance the ability of the viruses to infect the cells. So the vaccines actually make all subsequent isolates more infectious. Now, we pointed this out in a paper right at the beginning, long before the vaccines came out. Thomas Klein was the first author, and he published it in Frontiers in Immunology. We probably were the only people that did a full review of coronavirus vaccines. Why has not one ever worked? Why are they all toxic?
Well,
Why are they particularly very toxic in primates? Something they must have known, because they didn't do these vaccine trials in primates. Had they done, there'd have been deaths, and then they wouldn't have been able to proceed. Everything is a setup, absolute setup.
Well, I think that was a great description of antibody enhancement, by the way. Here's the paper from June 2020. I'll read out the highlighted part. COVID-19 candidate vaccines designed without appreciating these problems may run similar risks to those experienced with HIV vaccines that failed to show protection. The possibility of inducing autoimmune responses or antibody-dependent enhancements need to be carefully guarded against, because there is published evidence that an HIV candidate vaccine has actually enhanced infectivity. Vaccinations were halted. So you warned about this, that actually if anything, it's actually going to cause even more problems.
Well, thank you for highlighting that paper, because there's several very important things about that paper. First of all, the title. We actually had to use a title that implied this was a very good vaccine, when actually the paper was pointing out that it had come from the laboratory, and that the other thing that was really important in this is that the 80% of the epitopes of the spike protein was similar to humans, and therefore dreadful autoimmunity was guaranteed. We particularly highlighted platelet factor 4 and myelin as being, dead ringers, and that you would induce antibodies in these poor people, and that would lead to the problems associated with antibodies to PF4 is VIT. It's the thrombotic bleeding problem that they have, and that was described very early on. It was very obvious with the AstraZeneca vaccine, and the myelin was absolutely a known problem. The viruses have this myelin in, and that's associated with Guillain-Barré syndrome. Now, I know two people closely that had the Guillain-Barré. After I made it very clear, please do not have any more vaccines. They had it after the booster vaccines. And talk about saving the NHS. Both of those people spent months in hospital, paralysed. How's that saving the NHS with a useless vaccine? We'd already proven it is useless. It is now causing so much harm and damage that they don't want to admit it, because this fellow, when I again kept pointing out to him, why is this continuing? It can't just be using vaccines up. I said they should stop it now. And he said, another thing he said, words of wisdom, he said, there's far too many vested interests in here to stop it now. I'll repeat that. There are far too many vested interests in here to consider to stop it now.
What vested interest do you think?
I think the whole thing was set up. I think it goes right back to, this is why I think Kennedy is a genius. They call him an anti-vaxxer and God knows. This is because of the scientific work he's done in looking at whether vaccines work or are useful, etc. Because he's not a programmed scientist gone through the woke system of the universities, and I mean, it is even woke 20, 30 years in a way I only appreciate now, that wokery is so obvious. It was always subtle wokery. A lot of people wouldn't get through. I mean, I would never get through the system if I hadn't have gone up like a bagatelle from one job to another. It wasn't a logical move through the system. So anyway, I was saying that, Kennedy did this brilliant job on Fauci, and Fauci was first nobbled by his father. I didn't know that, but it's in the book, The Real Anthony Fauci, which I think should be a must-read for anybody going into government or health services or science or anything there. It's great. You've got a copy there. So have I. So have I. And what else does that book reveal? It's not just about Fauci. It is about Gates and the WHO.
Yes.
Garvey. This whole thing was planned. I mean, it might have set out with good intentions, but it's like everything, from the Nazis to Stalinism, everything. It just descends into, but we must consider the greater good. This is for the greater good.
Absolutely. Well, there's so many things you've just said there. So the thing is, look, I think the best way to prevent the next pandemic is to lock up all the people who did the last one. And Fauci and Bill Gates should be behind bars, frankly, and all the politicians and everybody should be behind bars. So what I want to ask you is, you talked about RFK's questioning vaccines. So I've gone from a position of, I had all the vaccines, had my children vaccinated early on when they were younger, but I've stopped all that now. I've looked into vaccines. I've looked into Dissolving Illusions by Roman Bristianic and Suzanne Humphreys, where they look at all the data. And it's clear that death from all childhood diseases were dropping down. I mean, there's so many graphs you can show. And vaccines always came afterwards. Clean water, sanitation, food, that's what saved people and stopped them getting these childhood diseases and dying from them. I question the whole thing about vaccination now. I've looked at the book Turtles All the Way Down. All the studies are woefully inadequate. They're so poor. There's never a proper randomized placebo study against a saline shot or whatever. It's always against another adjuvant or something or a previous vaccine. I question all vaccines. Now, someone who has had a career in developing vaccines for cancer, what's your position with vaccines now? Have you now turned around and gone, actually, the whole thing is a crock of shiitake mushrooms, or do you still believe in it?
I'm afraid my attitude is like Robert Kennedy's attitude now, is I've now uncovered that a lot of scientific evidence that I held as true was false, fabricated, and fraudulent. This at the time seems to be a big heresy, especially 20, 30 years ago when I was restarting. Well, it's 40 years ago. I was starting the HIV work and my receptor work, and then looking at the vaccine, etc. We now know that half the papers published in the top journals are rubbish. I mean, even the retiring editor Andreas Martha. The New Journal of Medicine said the same. And then the Richard Horton of The Lancet, who basically was absolutely rotten to us who questioned anything and wouldn't publish any of our papers, completely called us conspiracy, had the gall to say that half of the stuff he published was probably not true either. I mean, it's just unbelievable. So they were really straight out the Ministry of Truth, just publishing the narrative. Now look at the number of papers that Fauci has published. I mean, I think Fauci's probably published more papers than he's read, because I have seen him talk, and he does not understand some of the basic tenets of immunology. And he gives the impression he does, but what does he do? I've suffered from it, but I laugh at it. He stands up, talks louder, shouts louder, and says you don't know what you're talking about. Well, Rand Paul suffered this when he was cross-examining him in the Senate too. And Fauci told him that he didn't know what he was talking about, and Fauci was a doctor. Well, Rand Paul says, I've got news for you, Dr. Fauci. I'm also a doctor. I'm also an ophthalmologist. I do know what I'm talking about, so you can't shout me down. I mean, this is how
I know.
that guy did. And he does not He did not understand. So let's go back to something which you had in that paper, which I think was incredibly important, because I'd been going on about this. In 1984, I was at a meeting in Washington where Fauci stood up and guaranteed a vaccine in 18 months. And he got an enormous budget, millions and millions and millions. We applied for some of it because we'd come to a very simple reason. And then I ended up collaborating with Børge Sørensen in Norway, in Oslo, for exactly the same reason. It transpired we're probably the only two people in the planet who came to the same conclusion with all the available facts. If you have 3,000 epitopes on the HIV envelope and you throw it at the immune system in a guise of a vaccine, it is going to select. You can't see 3,000 epitopes at one go. The immune system will select on its core epitopes. If you've got 3,000, it's going to be different in everybody. And also, you're going to miss, because the virus has survived because it has escaped all the body's immune defences and antibodies. So we know it was very variable, etc. So the secret of an effective vaccine for HIV was to get rid of the envelope and just focus on the important ones. Now, the one I focused on was the only one that made it pathogenic, and it was the bit that stimulates the chronic immune activation. And we know from all the work we did over 20 years that people who don't get HIV, they all have very strong antibody and T-cell responses to this particular epitope. My colleague picked 4 epitopes out of the nucleus, which, were they not to exist in any sequence, the virus would collapse, it wouldn't be there. So in a stroke, we basically got 5 epitopes. The immune system would easily see that. There would be no antibody confusion, no antibody-dependent enhancement. And by the way, now looking again at all those big trials, that's what killed them. All the people in those big trials, whether it depended, whether it was the initial Genentech one or the ones that ended up in Thailand or South Africa, what they didn't tell you was they were all stopped. They said because of lack of futility, they were all stopped because the vaccine arm deteriorated far faster than the placebo arm. And that was due to antibody-dependent enhancement. So it absolutely proved it. And such was the arrogance of Fauci and Gates, because between us, we applied 3 major times for our support for our vaccine, even though we had data from clinical trials showing it was the only one that suppressed the virus load in HIV-infected patients. So that was incredible proof of futility. Each time we had it rejected, the NIH, Bill Gates, is the same wording. This is a very good plan B, but we don't need it because we've got a worldwide trial going on at the moment, and this will be almost certainly positive, then we won't need a plan B. Well, I've lived through 3 of all these worldwide trials, and each time we've applied again, and each time we were told exactly the same. Well, this time we've got it right. Well, they should have consulted Einstein, because if you keep doing the same thing, expecting a different answer, you're stupid.
Yeah.
Actually, that's exactly what's happened.
Gus, can I quickly just get you back on the childhood vaccines? Listen, you've got grandchildren. Would you get your grandchildren, and vaccinated with the childhood vaccines? With all the mercury and aluminium? Simple question, yes or no? Do you believe in these childhood vaccines?
Not all of them.
Which ones do you believe in?
This is where I'm not sure. I would like to look at them all very, very carefully. As you know, my entire effort at the moment is being to destroy messenger RNA vaccines to make sure we never use these again. So this has exposed me to lots of things. And I do a lot of reading and history. And when you were telling me about the vaccine, I know exactly the papers. I can see the graphs. This is measles, deaths from measles that slope the graph. This is when they introduced the vaccine. Right at the bottom, so I am now very, very suspicious because I just don't trust anything or anyone anymore, and I want to do it myself or with a group of people who I trust. And this is why I admire Kennedy so much, because he operates like a proper scientist, and all they do is shout at him as an anti-vaxxer, this, that, and the other.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So if you look at this mortality from scarlet fever, whooping cough, measles, diphtheria, smallpox, and you can see how it all comes down. It's all coming down. And where it's down, that's when penicillin comes, streptomycin, and the vaccines are coming in when everything's already flatlined. Vaccines are taking credit for something they never did. Now, the reason why I'm saying this, and I just want your clarification, is because, I don't know if you remember, you wrote this article for the Daily Skeptic, the disastrous COVID vaccines risk tarring all vaccines with the same brush. This was only 2 years ago. Now, what I'm hoping is your position has moved on from then, because I would take the stance that, great, one of the good things coming out of the disastrous COVID vaccines is that we get to examine all the vaccines and question them and realize the danger for what they are, because they use the holy grail, the term vaccine, to shield mRNA, because we're not allowed to question vaccines. And that in itself, Gus, makes you wonder why. Why, if this is such a great thing, why is it not strong enough to be scrutinized and have a microscope poured over it, a magnifying glass to look at? Because if it's as good as what they're saying, we should all be able to see, yep, it's wonderful. When you make it such a hot topic that you get suspended by the GMC, investigated by the GMC, censored and ridiculed by the media for being a crazy anti-vaxxer, that tells me they're hiding something. Now, have you moved on from 2 years ago when you wrote that piece?
Yes, I have. But I don't want to be deflected from the mission to destroy the messenger RNA vaccines, because I feel if I get involved with everything else at the moment, they will use that broad brush, anti-vax. No, I'm focusing on the messenger RNA, and I must say it has uncovered some very interesting things, and some of the stuff that hasn't got into the press, and I can't even quote you a paper. But I've spoken to oncologists specialising in gynecology, and I discovered something really horrendous, that they are witnessing young women who are developing aggressive cervical cancer, who have had their Gardasil, they've had their HPV vaccines, but in each case they had a COVID booster before. Now, let's accept the Gardasil vaccine was protecting them. All right. Then this is the scenario. But the fact they then get the cancer of the cervix aggressive after a booster vaccine, and I've shown that was almost certainly due to T-cell suppression, because once you start using boosters, you suppress the T-cell response. And a very good group have published this with a wonderful title called T-cell exhaustion in cancer patients after COVID vaccine boosters. That's the title. I mean, it just sums it up beautifully. So if you accept that HPV vaccine was working there, then it suddenly comes up after a COVID booster, which we know suppresses the T-cell response. So these vaccines induce such inflammatory responses that suppress the T-cell response, you even lose that control. Now, I've put this forward to fellow scientists who I trust and discuss, and they have raised this very issue is, well, how do you really know the Gardasil vaccines are now working, that they are now effective? And then I realise that the same thing is going on here. I find there's lots of people who have horrendous side effects from them, that pathologists I know say that all the vaccine has done is drive different variants. We know the two pathological variants, HPV 16, 18, but I'm told that in their studies, and this is not my area, that in the vaccinated areas, they're getting other oncogenic isolates, variants coming out, which weren't there before. So they're questioning the whole of that. My attitude is accept nothing, because I think so much so-called science was done to justify the means. And I'm horrified at how much science has been manipulated. We wrote the book, which I can do what you did.
Yeah, The Death of Science.
It says it all. That's how strongly driven we were to actually say science has been killed by all this. And it goes all the way back. This thread, it runs through everything, especially in one of the great chapters, and this is climate change. There's no science to justify net zero. Absolutely.
So going back to Gardasil, Gardasil's developed by Merck, by the way. Merck's been involved in a lot of shenanigans and has got into trouble. And there are concerns about the safety and efficacy of Gardasil, and the regulatory approval mechanisms and the corporate influence. There are severe side effects. I know someone who got Guillain-Barré syndrome, despite getting it after the Gardasil. Her daughter had it. She never convinced her daughter not to have it, so she's not an anti-vaxxer. Her daughter got Guillain-Barré syndrome and has since been plagued with problems, including cervical problems. And so it causes neurological problems, autoimmune conditions, chronic fatigue syndrome, and even deaths. And there's lawsuits taking place in the US and other countries, and they're having to go through this stupid American vaccine injury compensation program. And there is a lack of long-term safety data on Gardasil. It wasn't very well studied before it was approved, especially in the younger populations, especially in boys. You got Julie Gerd-Berdinger, former head of the CDC, who played a key role in approving Gardasil, and then later became president of Merck's vaccine division. Talk about revolving doors. And there's clear conflicts of interest. And there's someone else that was involved, and he was in a position of authority and had massive conflicts of interest. So it was approved through an accelerated process, despite concerns that it's not going to work and it might even lead to cancer. It just goes on. And now they're pushing it on the boys, and I mean, it's like they're just not even happy having the market in girls. They're now doing in boys. And I think this is all part, and actually, by the way, I don't know if you know, but Merck was even pushing heavily for mandatory vaccinations. It was lobbying for school-aged boys and girls to get mandatory vaccinations. I mean, what about the ethics of that? How wrong is that? So, this is the problem when you've got big pharma, massive aggressive lobbying, lack of long-term safety data, financial conflicts of interest. But not just that. The problem is this whole field of vaccinology is a holy grail. It's the holy cow. You cannot question it. If you question it, you're a heretic. You need to be destroyed. And that's not scientific. And that, to me, just tells me there's something not right with this vaccinology. Why does something need a PrEP Act, immunity from prosecution? If you've got a product that's amazing, you shouldn't be hiding behind that. So, I think it's just natural and normal. And if we're going to attack the mRNA vaccines, we need to highlight the problems of the whole field of vaccinology, because they're using the mRNA tech and shielding it with the term vaccine when there's nothing. Do you see what I mean? It's the vaccine is the problem, and now they're protecting this terrible technology, mRNA. And you've seen the drive. The drive is mRNA cancer vaccines. 500 billion AI Stargate program, day 2, Trump signed it in. I mean, if I was Big Pharma, or if I was the father of the vaccine, and knowing all the data that's come through and all the deaths and all the morbidities and all the problems of the mRNA COVID shot, I would be quiet. I would be laying low. I would be embarrassed and ashamed. I wouldn't be able to look in the mirror, and I would never talk about it ever again. But we're not seeing that. Yep. We're seeing Moderna and Pfizer boasting about their vaccines and boasting about the mRNA tech. We hear Trump still boasting about his mRNA jab and how it saved the pandemic, and pushing now mRNA vaccines, and the UK and America and all around the world, they're pushing this agenda. Yeah. And they want everyone to have mRNA tech inside their body. What the hell is going on, Angus?
Well, that's why Kennedy's appointment is so crucial to this, because he doesn't believe any of this. I know he doesn't want it. So we already realised that in the Trump administration, why it was so important for him to get that job, because you have these people announcing about using it. All I can say is that the people who say they're going to use it for everything are not scientists. They have been bought. They've been part of the corruption system, because I've spent years researching cancer vaccines, for instance. So I've been involved with virtually all the cancer vaccine trials I've been involved with, and none of them work. None of them have made it through. And the reason that none of them work is kind of a slight inverse to the infectious diseases I mentioned, whereas the secret for infectious disease complicated viruses is to choose a very few epitopes. Now, in cancer vaccines, they set out doing that, choosing a few epitopes. They call them the tumour-associated antigens and cancer-specific antigens, and they made lots of vaccines. And we've gone through one round after another. We've got it right this time. We got Marge, then we had Mark, then we had NYESO. I mean, it goes on and on and on, and they all fail. Why do they all fail? Because in the case of the tumour is, I mean, he's survival mode. He gets attacked because he's got a tumour antigen on it. Within a few weeks, that tumour no longer has that antigen on. So they escape the same way as they escape drugs. So just using a different technology to do this is not going to work. It might work as a gene therapy that fundamentally alters the genetics of the tumour and how it's progressing, etc. But it shows you the extreme naivety of these people. They don't understand the science. And I'm hoping that Kennedy will talk some sense into Trump about not going down this route. And I can speak with a lot more experience and confidence than most of these people, because I sat on the board of a company that called itself the Messenger RNA Vaccine Company, the scientific board. I sat on it for 5 years. I left nearly 8 years ago now. And what were they doing? They had the most advanced messenger RNA vaccines for every major known cancer, every major tumour. That side of things was all sorted. What was not sorted was how to stabilise and make sure the messenger RNA technology is safe. Now, I don't think they have improved one iota, and they manufactured this pandemic in order to get approval for this technology to save the world for the greater good. This is where this Stalinistic approach comes in, and this is why it is so dangerous, so we must get rid of it. Now, the reason I'm focusing at the moment on messenger RNA vaccines, and I'm now totally open. I don't question every vaccine. I want to look at the facts of everything. And those graphs, I know. I've been through lots of papers on that, and I totally agree. But the reason I'm so exercised about the messenger RNA vaccines is that the detailed research. I thought initially the risk was the suppression of the T-cell response when you gave it the first booster. It's very clear, and it gets worse with each booster. And if you've already been infected, that process can start earlier. I remember, I don't know if you got the clip, but I very much remember arguing. I think this was on ITV program with the microbiology pathology representative of the government and on the boards. I said, why on earth do you want to introduce a booster program unless you test people to see whether they need it? Oh, and they said, it's far too difficult to do all that testing. It's much easier to give the booster program. I mean, this was a mindset which is just unbelievable that's going on. So I thought that would explain. But then when I started delving in to the literature, we found out that the way that they were stabilising the messenger RNA allowed it to insert virtually anywhere, then alter with the coding of the actual genome. And then goes on, we found that they were riddled with contaminants, cDNA. We thought it was just a mere 30 times above the acceptable level. When I was in Australia, the more samples they tested, we were up to 145 times the safe level. And then we found that all the Pfizer contain SV40. I mean, and we had people arguing, but it's a promoter or an antigen. I don't care. SV40 is bloody dangerous. In the laboratory, you use SV40 to induce cancers in mice so you can then test anti-cancer treatments on the tumour. The fact it's in all these things, I mean, the MHRA, FDA, TGA, they should all ban the whole thing. This is going into children. And then the next bit is even worse. They bind all the known suppressor genes, P53, BRCA, MSH, that's the Lynch syndrome. Now, we know if you've got a mutation in any one of those genes, you're destined or doomed, more likely, to get the cancer you would normally have got at 70 or 80 in your 30s and 40s. I mean, this is an absolute potential disaster. And they're wanting children to have these for viruses that's never going to kill them. Now do you see why I am so... This is like a genocide that's going on. And that's why it must be stopped. Then we can deal with all these others. And I agree, we have made mistakes. And I think that's because the quality of science, of biological science, with a few exceptions, and some of whom I've worked for, has been universally so bad once Big Pharma gets involved. It crushes inconvenient truths and it pushes the conclusion. In fact, nothing really epitomizes what went on, what's been going on for years, I believe. So much was the introductory statement of Hugo Keith, the QC, in the vaccine inquiry.
Hi, me again. You're listening to the Doc Malik podcast. This show is 100% independent and fully funded by listeners like yourself. So if you wish to support Ahmed in all that he is doing, then please subscribe to his channel on Spotify or on his Substack, or simply buy him a coffee with one of the donation links which can be found at docmalik.com. Now, let's get back to the show.
Who's in his opening statement said, we all know these vaccines have saved millions of lives and are safe and effective. But we're here today because a few people are complaining that they've had side effects, which they think's due to the vaccine. I mean, it was unbelievable. He gave confusion before it started, and he dismissed all our evidence. He said it was not necessary to look at the evidence. This is what's been going on. Big retrospective. I now see this process has been creeping up on us all the time. And people who, like me, start questioning this are regarded as extreme irritants to be disposed of and brushed out of the way. And that's what's been going on.
Yep, 100%. 100%. I mean, the thing as well is about the cancers with these mRNA jabs. I think there's about 40 different modes of mechanism in which they induce cancer. It's not just the SV40s. It's actually incredible, the different...
The last slide I made, with a lot of help from my colleagues, there were 10 major ways that messenger RNA-based vaccines could induce or promote cancer.
Now, I just want to talk about cancer. Do you know cancer and chemotherapy is the biggest earner for Big Pharma? The cancer research industry is about $1 trillion. It's huge. And despite all the money being pumped into cancer, in the last 50 years, we've seen cancer rates just go skyrocket through, So what I'm trying to say is, the funniest thing is it's the poorest return for any investment that I've ever seen. Now, I think it's also because we're barking up the wrong tree. Now, we were told at around 2000, the millennium, you know what, when the Human Genome Project is accomplished, we're going to be able to cure all the cancers and diseases, and we hear nothing about it because they've realized that it's not just the genes. Epigenetics, it's not genes that dictate disease, probably less than 5%, and that includes cancers. Cancer is a metabolic disease. It's hyperinsulinemia. It's a diabetic thing that's going on. Diabetes is skyrocketed, insulinemia, insulin resistance. This is the problem. And if you look at David Rasnick's work and his colleague and Thomas Seyfried, they talk about the metabolic problem and how these cancer cells are growing and metabolizing. And no one looks at treating cancer in that way and talking about the role of fasting or, for example, the way ivermectin and fenbendazole, they work not because of the antiparasitical things, but because they target the metabolic pathways of the cancer cells. No one ever talks about that. You never talk about diet and nutrition and ketones and that when it comes to treating cancer. Don't you think that's a massive blind spot? And the reason why is there's no money in that, and there's money in chemotherapy drugs and mRNA vaccines.
Well, I mention Robert Kennedy again, because that is very much his approach, is making America healthy again, because it is the majority of them are obese, high blood pressure, diabetes, all these things which actually make them sitting ducks for cancer.
Yeah, but forget RFK in America. What do you think of what I've said? Do you not agree that our approach to treating cancer should be treating the hyperinsulinemia that everybody has now, the toxic processed foods, everybody, get rid of their obesity, fasting, the importance of fasting. And if you have got cancer, the importance of a keto diet and getting the ketone glucose ratio correct. There is so much more to treating cancer than just chemotherapy. Wouldn't you agree?
I totally agree, and I think we were probably the first people to spot the missing links when I was doing all my immunotherapy studies in melanoma patients. 30 years ago, long before immunotherapy burst onto the scene and became effective with these big blockbuster drugs, etc. I was told at the time I had my grants turned down on the grounds that the tumour immunotherapy was something confined to mice and would never translate to the human condition, and I had that from world experts, according to the CRUK. Well, look how wrong, again, the experts were, and they don't grasp the science. The reason for telling you this is that I was just staggered. We had a certain type of immune stimulant followed by a T-cell growth factor, and we had some fantastic responses of melanoma. But they were the minority. So the majority, nothing happened. So we basically, one of the projects, I got funded with charity, the ICVI has funded all my work as the CRUK was so blinded as to where this was going to go. And so we searched for what was the difference between the responders and the non-responders. And we did proteomics and things like that. And then we were able to get something terribly simple came in. And this is how recently it came in as available. I could ask for my patients to be checked. And remember, I'm in Tooting when I was doing this work, which has a very large non-white population. And what became really obvious, it was obvious I didn't even need a statistician. I did not even need to talk to a statistician. That the only people who responded to this immunotherapy had normal vitamin D levels. All the people who didn't had really low vitamin D levels. So we started to supplement, and our response rate went up. And it got to the stage where I basically made that part of the protocol. There's no point treating these people if they got low vitamin D. You've got to correct that first. I even gathered a group of people, and we went up to NICE, who basically were so interested, they said they'd put it on their next 5-year program to look at. It was something you can get over the counter. It could have been immediate. This is what we're dealing with. Now, I see, and I only see sort of second opinions and things like that these days. I am staggered by, in spite of the fact that we took this to the point, we went and presented at ASCO, where we did an immunotherapy with pancreatic cancer with chemo versus chemo alone, randomized study, and our data was really good, highly significant improvement in outcome with the immunotherapy. And I was openly criticised from the floor, there's been 5 of these presentations, why is yours the only one that's got a positive result? And I said, if you look at this wall print, we're the only ones that insisted that all the patients had to have their low vitamin D corrected before we did the treatment. And I think that is the reason. The same guy who was very aggressively asking me these questions, virtually saying we must have fiddled the data, I now realise he had a good point. You have to ask everybody they fiddled the data. He called me up 3 months later. He said, I've never heard of this. And he said, I've never looked for it, but I am the biggest trialist at pancreatic cancer in America. And he said, I was so intrigued by the presentation that I put a research project on it. And he said, I'm phoning you up to tell you that you say it's just for immunotherapy. He said, I've never done an immunotherapy trial in my life, but I've done 4,000 patients in chemo trials. And he said, we've analysed them all. And he said, it is so obvious. He said, when you look, he said, we never looked before. He said, if you've got a low vitamin D, you'll never respond to chemotherapy. How many people have suffered chemotherapy with no hope of responding because they haven't looked at the vitamin D? And we couldn't even get NICE to admit it. The most they will do is say, this gets on to where you're coming from. Apparently there's a national committee on diet, advice on diet, who say you only need 400 international units of vitamin D3. Well, I worked through that. I took that initial advice, and after a month, low vitamin D didn't budge. You had to give them thousands.
Yep.
To bring it up. So this is where I'm coming from, is that we are aware that chemo and everything like that, and more people are. There's a massive meta-analysis paper that was presented at ASCO it was a year before 1718, which showed a meta-analysis of all studies showed that if vitamin D levels were measured and increased to the normal level at the time of diagnosis, the outcome in cancer patients, this was across all tumour types, all therapy, the outcome was improved by 13%. Put it in perspective, tamoxifen, the world's first blockbuster oncology drug, improved the outcome by 8%. So you can see where we're coming from. Just correcting a vitamin D deficiency had twice the impact of the tamoxifen drug for breast cancer. And so what we need to do is now go through all these areas. And of course, this has taken us into things like the microbiome and the optimal diet. And how do you get an optimal microbiome? There's all sorts of detailed things. You take probiotics, you can have fecal transfers. A high fiber diet will give it to you.
Listen, Angus, the thing is, I've looked into this as well, and it's really quite simple, and we overcomplicate things. I'll tell you one thing, I'll never be taking any chemotherapy drugs if I get cancer. You know, if you look at animals in the wild, they don't get cancer the way we do, but that's because they're eating their species-specific diet. The only species in the planet that doesn't eat its species-specific diet are human beings, you know. So, I mean, that's ultimately, I think, the problem. And that's why I'm writing my book, Doc Malik's Simple Guide to Good Health. We've forgotten what it means to be healthy. You don't need probiotics and fecal transplants. You know, if you just simply follow the simple things that are out there, you'll be fit and healthy. You know, you've got a book called The Cancer Resolution.
Now, I'm showing you this book here. Yeah. Because this book is the ultimate of it is the environment, the metabolics, so metabolic dislocate, and how to go about correcting it. All the things you're implying to. This is a fantastic piece of work. It's by Mark Lintern, who has a LinkedIn profile and a web profile, etc. So I would really recommend this. It took me quite a while to read.
Well, I'll recommend some books to you as well. The author Travis Christofferson has written some books, and you know, things like your social isolation, how much love you have in your life, how much you're out in natural sunlight, your vitamin D levels, blue light, for example, that's a risk factor for cancer. And you know, lack of proper sleep, if you're a night worker, you know, there's simple things. Staying away from processed foods and seed oils. It's not hard. And that's how you reduce the risk of cancer. And the best way to treat cancer is not to get it in the first place. Anyway, I want to just ask you something. You know, what happened last time was your computer ran out of data and it got cut off at a cliffhanger. And I was asking you this thing. I was saying, Gus, can I ask you something? You talked about the sequence you and your colleague looked at. Apparently, the sequence was published by China. Now, there's a lot of people who are in the awake movement, I don't like using that word, who are questioning whether there was even a COVID virus, SARS-CoV-2. They say nothing's been isolated. No one's physically isolated the virus. Now, what's your stance on this? Do you actually still believe that there was a virus? Some people like J.J. Couey talks about viral clones wrapped up in lipid nanoparticles. And literally, you know, if you look at Sasha Latopova's work, you know, they talk about a payload. They talk about this, you know, bioweapon payload. You know, was there, you know, any virus? Was this just simply a genetic sequence in a lab where they're tinkering? And where you know, what was COVID? Was it aerosol poison? Was it 5G radiation? Was it flu rebranded? What are your thoughts?
Oh man, that paper you showed, we've very carefully analysed it. It has had to be the virus because there's a massive literature of it evolving. It evolves from this RAT-TG13 backbone, which did come from the caves 1,000 miles away. It was brought back, and the Wuhan lab actually published several papers of doing genetic inserts into it to make it more infectious for human cells. This has been going on for some years, and some of those inserts were actually the ones published. So, and I do think that it escaped. I think that it was a proper virus. It did cause that. The clinical explosion that they did have in Wuhan, which they thought they were going to contain much better than it did. So it was a problem. And the reason it did cause this was because in that paper we explained very well, and again, none of my molecular people seem to basically understand this. They're not interested in the sequences, or interested in what they mean they translate to. What they translated to was a run of peptides giving the virus a charge, a very highly positive charge, which made it infect human cells so strongly it was like a fridge magnet. I mean, it didn't have to go through if you look at the viruses infecting cells under electron microscopy, a focal microscopy, etc., you can see they go on the cell surface and they hunt and they probe, and then they find the receptor, and then they have to have a second receptor. And the whole process is quite slow. And with the STARS one that came out of the Wuhan lab, it not only did it slap onto the main ACE2 receptor, but it was so powerfully charged, it was able to use secondary receptors, which no other a virus of that caliber, type, had used before. And the interesting one, my colleague Birger Sorensen basically said, you realise that these secondary receptors include those which involve taste and smell receptors. I mean, it all fitted really well. But the thing is, a highly charged virus like that, made artificially, is not going to last very long. It's going to go, and then it'll collapse. And we know that the Omicron one, which came was the second isolate, it was really quite different. It had evolved very much faster. Going back, it did seem to come from a population that had been vaccinated previously, and this was something that has been commented on. That variants came from, the Kent and the Brazil. All these were from vaccinated populations. By which time the virus is completely different. So the Omicron actually was the world's first useful vaccine, because it was very infectious but not very dangerous and airborne, go through populations literally like wildfire. So you didn't need a vaccine after that. And yet here, after Omicron, we were told by Whitty and Vallance that this is the most dangerous thing known to man, and you must lock down again, prepare for...
Yeah.
And if they had listened to the South African doctors, which they treated with contempt, which I was absolutely embarrassed. Again, it's disgraceful, I would say negligent behaviour, because the South African doctors were telling them this actually is not a problem, and once you get infected with this, you seem to be immune from everything. So we didn't need the vaccine.
So I'm really confused about this whole gain of function. I'm on the fence whether I actually believe in it or there was actually a virus or not. I'll be honest with you. I mean, the whole thing about variants. How can you have one specific variant when it's meant to be spreading around the world with like wildfire and mutating? How'd you get one variant at a time? And wasn't there something about leaked messages from Matt Hancock talking about releasing the next variant? What the hell did that mean?
Oh, well, what we do know in the Wuhan lab, which was funded, even though Fauci denied it to the Senate and Rand Paul, he was funding it through the Eco Health Alliance, run by Peter Daszak, on the grounds that meant he wasn't funding it. But that was the first major thing we realised that something really quite sinister was going on here, because it'd been going on for a while. The main American contributor was Ralph Barrick from North Carolina, Chapel Hill, who was the world's first person to sew RNA together without leaving a footprint. And that's how everyone told me that these inserts there's no footprint, so they can't be inserts. It means they don't even keep up with their own specialty. I mean, even I knew Ralph Barrick was a big RNA jock, as we would call it. What he's referring to was, in that lab, they had 600 isolates, and they were working on lots of different inserts. They were working on, lots of other things which were to escape. And then we found that Fauci was also in charge of basically what was the germ warfare component of the US. So he literally was the person in charge of making the very agents. And remember, without this gain of function, there would have been no COVID. There would have been no lockdown. And what they've got others there. They've got others sitting there. And we know this is part of a very sinister program because, again, in our searches, we found that the actual sequence of the SARS-2, which was published in Nature, which we referred to and we did our analysis on, the actual sequence was published as a patent by Moderna in February 2019. This is for a virus that there was no notion of it escaping till September, October 2019. So why would you patent for a vaccine for a virus that didn't exist? So this gets more and more sinister.
So it was a pandemic.
It was a pandemic.
Right. Next. So, I want to talk about COVID, right? So we were told, for example, the government website in Australia said it's a common respiratory symptoms of fever, coughing, sore throat, shortness of breath. We've since looked at all-cause mortality. It didn't go up with COVID. You had this little bleep of, deaths from nursing homes or residential homes, but that was all hospital protocol driven, midazolam and remdesivir. How did something that was so mild, how did it become something that, vaccines were the solution? What was the process? Why was it that, there was mass vaccination of the population was the only way forward? We were told that you're going to have lockdown until we get a vaccine. Talk me through that. How did that happen? Who decided this? What was the process? Where are the minutes for these meetings?
Well, this would appear to be top-down driven by the WHO. Which had basically been infiltrated by Gates and China, who, were their main funders for it. I mean, if you want to go where the money is, as it were, you go for the WHO. Who is in charge of it? This Tedros, I can't pronounce his name, I'm afraid, but he's the first non-medic. He was put in for this post by China.
No, Gates. Gates put him in there.
Basically, as a highly manipulatable fellow, because
he's apparently a terrorist, isn't he?
I don't know that. I don't know.
Some country has labelled him a terrorist because he used to be part of some Eritrean army or something like that. Anyway, carry on.
Well, it comes from Ethiopia, which is very unstable, so he could have been anything. But it was very clear he was put in so China could just use him as a useful tool. And this is something else I discovered.
Oh, sorry. What I meant was he's got ties to the Tigray People's Liberation Front. He's a high-ranking member of TPLF, which is a Marxist-Leninist organization that was part of Ethiopia's ruling coalition.
Yes.
The Ethiopian government designated the TPLF as a terrorist group in 2021. Critics argue that Tedros helped cover up human rights abuses during his tenure as Ethiopia's Minister of Health from 2005 to 2012 and Minister of Foreign Affairs from 2012 to 2016. And some claim that his handling of public health crises was politically motivated.
Well, that's detail I did not know about, but it fits in with everything.
There's no evidence that he's a terrorist. There is claims that he's associated with the TPLF, which is designated a terrorist group. There you go.
Well, what we do know is that it was China and Gates that made him get that job because he didn't have any of the credentials for it. In fact, the central WHO, as it were, they wanted David Navarro in, and he was had by far the best credentials for it and was pushed aside by Gates and China. Now, why?
Sorry, one quick thing. Don't you think you've got a blind spot when it comes to China and Bill Gates? Aren't they all working in cahoots? I mean, if you go back to, again, Sasha's and Catherine Watt's work and Debbie Lerman, there's American DOD fingerprints over everything. Moderna and Pfizer didn't make this. BioNTech, They were just working as agents, contractors for the DoD. This was a global DoD intelligence operation.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not going to argue with any of this, but what I am going to point out, 'cause I think it was crucially important to what happened to us, was that if the WHO had been remotely competent in the outbreak in Wuhan, it would never have spread abroad here. And the China stopped the WHO from doing all the necessary things.
Well, so what do you mean if WHO stopped? I mean, but we know that COVID wasn't anything serious. It didn't need lockdowns. It didn't need quarantines.
I totally agree with that, but they didn't know that at the time. We didn't know at that time. Now,
So the best thing that the WHO could have done was nothing, surely. The WHO should not have done anything. Just leave it. People should have gotten early treatment, oxygen where they needed it, antibiotics if they got a secondary bacterial infection, vitamin D. A vast majority of people just had a sniffle. It was nothing to worry about.
I agree with that. I'm talking about when it broke out in China, because the WHO's incompetence led to it so-called escaping from China. And the reason why Tedros, he did what the China wanted to do, and the reason that China wanted to take over the WHO was the last time that they had SARS, they had taken, I've forgotten her name now, the lady who was in charge of the WHO. She came in and took control, and SARS was never really a major issue. And they were furious at the way that they were pushed around and bullied. They weren't going to have...
But what do you mean take charge? I mean, let it get out. Who cares? It's nothing serious. It's nothing mild. Nothing needs to be done about it.
It was, and I disagree. At the time in China it was, and the first escape of a highly charged virus is going to be very, very dangerous. And it was. I mean, there were even young people were dying of it in Wuhan. If we are to believe what we were told, right? I listened to that. We do know that the outbreak in Italy was highly magnified and overblown to instill fear and prepare us all that if it comes here, we're going to have to lock down and be that. Yeah. But I do think the situation when it broke out and leaked in China was different from when, by the time it had got to the UK, it's a different animal.
I've looked at this, and you should listen to my podcast with Nick Hudson. Droster, the German guy, blew it out. The initial paper talks about this mild flu-like symptoms, patient number 1. Honestly, based on that one chap who had nothing unusual or different than anyone else, suddenly it got labelled it was sequenced, it was labelled a disease, a new pandemic, all within 28 days, and the way it was manufactured, I've got the timeline on the Nick Hudson podcast. It's ridiculous. There's nothing serious, lethal, dangerous about it, but they've packaged it and created it. That's when the bomb went off of the pandemic. And I would ask you to go back and look at that a little bit more carefully, Gus, because honestly, there was nothing deadly about it. Honestly. Right, anyway, moving on, I just want to ask you, how did it work during the government here? You got the WHO coming up with all this nonsense about a pandemic and everything. Why and who, what was going on with our politicians where they were committed to doing lockdowns, social distancing, masking, which has no evidence whatsoever. And actually all the pandemic plans beforehand showed that these were unhelpful and actually harmful to our society and our population and our health. And then pushing this, we need a vaccine. What were the meetings? And you even talked about it. You talked about in my podcast, you said it was like it was all predetermined and anyone who disagreed was a troublemaker. What do you mean? What did you see behind the scenes? Can you explain that a little bit more?
Well, I didn't see anything behind the scenes because I wasn't allowed behind the scenes. That's the first thing. So I must make that very, very clear. All I had interactions with the government right at the beginning through Michael Gove and Chris Whitty, and that's when we alerted them, do not use the spike protein as a vaccine, which completely brushed aside. I was dismissed by one source, Chris Whitty, I'm just a cancer doctor, what do I know? Ignore him. Well, we ended up knowing a hell of a lot more than the rest of them put together. And we said, you mustn't do that. If you do go for a plan for a vaccine, you must look at avoiding the spike protein. That's what we said at the beginning. That's before we knew anything else that came. And then when we found out that the vaccine was unlikely to work, we communicated all this, by which time they were just not only ignoring us, but each communication led to me being reported to the Central Disinformation Unit as a misinformation spreader. I mean, that's what I knew. But, so I was not an insider. I just had a courier for stuff. But what we saw and what we then put forward, just what we read, we realised, if you look at things that, in here, I'm just showing how I'm being very objective. Whitty and Valence, initially, before all this went on and the SAGE got involved, they said very sensible things, really sensible things. So we felt fairly relaxed. I mean, they said, this is it's airborne. It will natural immunity is the way to go. Just let it go through. So the people pushing the vaccine said, "Oh, you're prepared for it to be a granny killer." And I was called a granny killer on an LBC program when I was arguing against lockdown, not even about the vaccine. I was just called that. You say, "You're a granny killer," and I had loads of abuse for all this sort of stuff. So this was an environment that was being created to do this, when the science, even Whitty and Valence appreciated initially that this didn't require any of this. The question you should be asking is, why did they change their mind and not intervene? And it's no good saying everybody did it. What we do know, the government was got at by Fauci. And there is a very famous telephone conversation between Fauci, Jeremy Farrar, and Patrick Vallance, which became available under Freedom of Information. But it's so redacted that the real meaning of it is you have to guess. But it's pretty obvious that basically Fauci was telling them, say, this is what you've got to do. You've got to get them to lock down this, that, and the other till we get the vaccine. So they all seem to have gone along with this. And it's very interesting that Jeremy Farrar, who was only the head of the Wellcome Trust at the time, was then elevated to the WHO, the main scientific director of the WHO after this conversation. So it looks like there was rewards all round for following this Fauci order. And the more I've looked into Fauci, the less there is. I mean, there's no science. He was on that interview and he said, "If you're criticising me, you're criticising the science." And he stormed off. I mean, he thought he was the science. Again, he was aware that masks make no difference, that they admitted the social distancing was made up. It was all part of this fear control program that went on. And the big thing is, how on earth did society and everybody fall for it? And I am amazed. And they were, I think, very surprised they fell for it, because they were warned the British people won't put up with things like lockdown. But not only did they put up with it, they embraced it. And you did not have to do it. And this is what the big important point in this is, you did not have to do it. Whitty and Valence should have stood up and said, enough is enough, we're not doing it. Because Angus Dalgleish did in Sweden. His entire academy went against it, but he said no. Lockdown would be a disaster, and he was turned out to be completely and utterly correct. Sweden had the lowest excess deaths in the whole of the Western world as the only country who did not lock down. So we know that the lockdowns were unbelievably dreadful. And I was shouting from the trenches all the way through that apart from the illnesses and the inability to pick up cancer early and treat, I was aware of 4 suicides amongst the groups that I work with, people who couldn't put up with lockdown and the isolation. They never considered any of these things for a virus that didn't kill anybody who was fit and healthy. It was just beyond belief. But Angus Dalgleish was the thing you can put up and say, Chris Whitty, why did you fall for this and go along with this? He blames the politician. No. His job was to stand up to the politicians and say, you're not allowed to do this. And it does occur. Governments can actually make their decisions, and the people who are there in charge, that is their job. If they won't listen, he should have resigned. He should have said, if you're not going to do this, I'm going to resign. In Sweden, everybody in the Academy of Sciences, Karolinska, etc., they all wanted Anders Tegnell to resign, but he had long, cool, calm, collected discussions with the Prime Minister, who put his trust in him, and he did the right thing. As unfortunately, our Prime Minister at the time completely, utterly useless. For somebody who idolised Churchill, he should have actually read his own research a little bit better. Churchill said, in a crisis, I always listen to all the experts before deciding which ones to ignore.
Exactly. That's the 10th man or whatever it is. You're meant to listen to the person who's the dissident, who's questioning everything, not the ones that everyone's agreeing with. Listen, that paper you did in 2020, where you things aren't right. You can't trust these vaccines, and you're very skeptical. Listen, I know you've said this already, but I think it's important that you have contrition about the lack of informed consent. But just explain this. If you knew a year earlier that these vaccines wouldn't work, why a year later did you go on Daily Mail and write a couple of articles telling people that, AstraZeneca and Pfizer, Moderna, they've done rigorous safety checks?
Mm-hmm.
And we hear about people...
Because at the time, I was pushed and convinced that they knew things that I didn't know in spite of all this. We now know it was a complete and utter lie and part of the Blob Information Act. And immediately that came out, I was furious because I did not write that.
I know. You said, I think the words you used were, you were coerced into coercing people. Is that correct?
Probably. That's I can't remember what I said, but what I do know, I was hit, and it was a telephone discussion that ended up with that paper. So my concerns about it were not transmitted to that, and it was thereafter I realised that we've been lied to, we've been used. I felt really dreadful about it. I make no bones about it, which is why I've got super suspicious of absolutely everything, which is why my whole role now is focused on making sure that messenger RNA vaccines never get used for infectious diseases ever again. And my God, that mountain is enormous, because Sunak gave Moderna the full powers to build a big vaccine thing at Didcot near Oxford, and signed up. We're paying taxpayers' money, 100 million a year for 10 years. That's $1 billion. And then when I went to Australia, I found they'd done exactly the same in Australia. They've got the government to give them 10 years, £100 million worth to do the vaccine. And they have to pay that, even if they don't come up with the vaccine. So now they're coming up with candidates like RSV, norovirus, and even if you had, like, for instance, for a norovirus, even if you had an ordinary vaccine, bear in mind that if informed consent says, you must say that vaccines often induce mild symptoms of the symptoms that would be caused if you got infected. Well, with norovirus, I would not like to have mild vomiting and diarrhea for the sake of not getting it before. So why are you using? So my point is, why are you even thinking of using this messenger RNA technology for these things which do not kill?
I know.
If they're going to kill you if you're on at death's door. So
I know.
This is what's so dreadful. That did not go out to tender, and I am told from reliable sources that Sunak's wife is involved with Moderna as a shareholder, indirectly, etc. How on earth could all this happen under our noses without being declared?
I know, but listen, going back to the valid informed consent is the basic tenet of medical ethics. And you're a medical practitioner, I'm a medical practitioner. You know it's completely wrong for a doctor to use the media to demand that millions of people submit to a highly questionable medical intervention, which is a complete violation of the doctor-patient relationship. And, those articles did that in your name. Now, what I don't understand is, why are you not livid with the Daily Mail? They trashed that. That's your name on it. And I'd be livid. Why didn't you sue them? Why didn't you complain about them? Why don't you talk about this and say, look, this is how they lied and they did something in my name that's wrong. And what's incredulous is someone like me or Dr. Sam Y or Dr. Anne McCloskey or Dr. Jerry Waters, all we said was, oh, you know what, there's vaccine injuries and this is wrong and mandates are wrong. And we get suspended, investigated and lose our livelihoods. People like Jackie Stone took her life. And, and you went on the Daily Mail, one of the most, the digital format is, I think, the most widely read newspaper online in the world. You went out there and trashed medical ethics by promoting these jabs. And nothing happened to you or to the Daily Mail. The GMC haven't investigated it. I mean, surely you should go to the GMC and say, look, this is wrong. What happened? And I was abused. This was taken out of context. I want to complain about what was done in my name. Don't you think so?
Yeah, but I tell you, it's even worse than that, because there is an entire agenda for the mainstream media to basically to do absolutely nothing and I've heard the words used all the time, to make the public lose confidence in the vaccines. Now, you go on about the Daily Mail, you should see the stuff that I have put forward about the vaccines that they will not publish. I have had things that I've written myself have gone through, have been up there, all ready to go and be published, put up online. They're not there. They're not in the paper. And then the people who got me to do this and are behind it and agree, they say, well, the editor said there was something more important that had to be in instead. It's been censored. It's been censored by the government that anybody who criticises the vaccines is actually the criminal. And that is basically what is going on now. I have tried every single major media. I have got the only time I've cracked the mainstream media was when I was in Australia. And this is available. Australia Sky News interviewed me. The producer, like other people who interviewed me, have actually told me they've got to be very careful because they're not to do anything that might make the public lose confidence in the vaccine, which is an irony. It's nearly laughable if it wasn't so seriously sad. And but the guy said, I'm going to let you say what you like, because he said, we'd be warned that we could lose jobs over this. But he said, I have seen so many friends of mine suffer from these vaccines, I can't take it any longer. Just say what you need to say. So I did. And it was the most watched item in Australia that week. And it's still available. Nobody in the UK took it up. I mean, they should have actually allowed me to go over all this again. That's why we do podcasts, is because the mainstream media is being run by the government and Bill Gates. We now know that in all this exchange going on with the Telegraph, I'm having furious problems, like Elizabeth Hart is as well with the Daily Telegraph. We now find that even the Telegraph gets millions from the Gates Foundation. So those things don't come without strings attached. We know the Guardian wouldn't exist without Gates. Now it's looking like the BBC wouldn't exist without Gates. Now we know that Zuckerberg basically said he wished he hadn't taken the millions from Biden and censored everything about the vaccines. I mean, it just goes on and on. This is the evil at the heart of all this, and this needs to be addressed. And when we had in Australia, we had some very interesting debating days with an awful lot of legal things. And of course, the doctors come out really, really bad on this. But the legal people bringing it out really say, when you talk of ethics and people doing the jobs, the doctors failed miserably about it, and the regulators failed miserably. But actually, the people who should carry the can, who failed even more miserably, were the mainstream media. Their job is to report the truth and to do all these investigations and expose the truth and the corruption at the heart of everything. So you have papers like the Telegraph, which did this with all the MPs' expenses scandal, what have you. The Sunday Times is very, very proud of exposing all sorts of scandals like the thalidomide, this, that and the other. Why did every single one of them basically not report on this properly, not investigate properly. Not one of them did it. And I think they have to take. I would be disgusted if I was a journalist in this current environment, because they're not reporting the truth. They're just basically cogs in a government machine which is open up straight out of 1984. It's the Ministry of Truth. It's all been controlled. You're not allowed to say anything unless we approve it. If it's the truth, well, we're not very keen on the truth, so you better shut up. Otherwise, something will happen to you. And it did. The people lost the jobs and everything like that. So I think we have to really open up the whole art of reporting. Now, as you know, I've been on GB News an enormous number of times, and I've discussed things, especially lockdowns, vaccines and things like that. I've spoken, but they say, once again, we've got to be very careful. We're not allowed to say, because anybody who has linked the vaccine with injury, like Mark Stein, Dan Wootton, I mean, the list goes on, Mark Dolan. I mean, anybody who's actually reported the truth is gone, lost the job.
Me? What do you think got me suspended? Same thing. Anyway, listen, I agree. Listen, I'll be honest with you, for the longest time, I didn't know whether you're controlled opposition or limited hangout. I thought, how is it that you get away with everything? But, I think you're showing some contrition, and I think you are trying to expose the evil. I think you might have some blind spots. I'm hoping that you're genuine and you're a good guy, but I'll be honest with you, I did have questions about you. I wasn't sure, but I like the fact you're having this conversation with me, so I appreciate that. Can I ask you something? Have you looked into the mRNA and the role of nanotech? Because I've been looking at technocracy, I've been looking at communitarianism. I think there's a much bigger agenda. You talk about China. China's a servant of the real people who are running the world. I think all the governments are actually corporations owned by the ruling predator class. Politicians are simply middlemen, agents of the real bad people. And what they want is, communitarianism, this language that you talked about, the greater good. That's what that's all about. It's all about, your individual rights. Yeah, they're important, but actually when it comes to the majority, when it comes to the community, when it comes to the greater good, your individual rights can be trashed. And this is communitarianism, this merger of, capitalism and communism and fascism. That's where we're heading.
Well, that's what the WEF's all about.
That's what the WEF.
I thought it was a talking club, but no, it's a very sinister organisation.
Yeah, so part of that is the mRNA tech. They want, to inject technology within us as well. Have you looked into nanotech and stuff like that?
No, not yet.
You might want to. And I thought it was all about crazy woo-woo stuff, but it's real. This the Internet of Things, the Internet of Bodies. Have you heard of any of this stuff?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I've been sent all this sort of information, and I take notice, and it frightens me, I must say. But my job is very, very focused, and I've learnt you've got to be very focused to get something achieved, and that is the messenger RNA. Once we've got rid of that being a vaccine, I will move on to all these other things and investigate it with the same vigour that I've used for the messenger RNA.
And I think there's a role for everyone to do this kind of stuff. But I've got people who will tell me, 5G. It's all about 5G.
Yeah, I've heard of this. I've been sent loads of books and articles, everything about it. But as I said, I'm going to focus on the messenger because that is the immediate thing.
Yeah, that's fine. I think that's I think that's good. But I see what I'm doing is collecting all the jigsaw pieces and building the bigger picture. And we need people to do the little focused target, work like you are on mRNA, like France's leader is on 5G and other people are doing on other stuff. Absolutely, because this is a multi-pronged war against humanity. I mean, there's, they talk about, how the media and mind control. That's another tool. That's another piece of the jigsaw puzzle. The thing is, but it's a 100-piece, 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle. What I try to do is get as many of these pieces together so that we can build a picture of what's happening. The danger is if you focus on just one thing, you don't appreciate how we're actually being attacked and how actually everything is linked. Everything is actually linked. But no, I do see the role of people like you focusing on one thing in particular. And I am worried about mRNA and how they are hell-bent on getting everyone injected with this stuff. And I'm worried about this role of testing for everything and then prophylactic injections. Do you see that happening as well?
I can see that's what we know that's that Big Pharma wants. I mean, the reason they're going into vaccines, and the senior executive of Big Pharma said, I don't know why we're messing around with these drugs. We're much better going for vaccines. Then everybody has to have them, and we can make the governments make them mandatory. So it's a much more reliable source of income. I mean, that is how they're thinking. And so once they get them in, they want to expand the population. That's why the original COVID vaccines were people 70 and above, and they ended up coming right down to kids. I mean, it was just extraordinary. But that's what the shareholders were. And Pfizer and Moderna said, we're not interested in the population. Our only loyalty is to our shareholders. I mean, so the first thing you have to do is remove the identity for all companies making vaccines. Absolutely. That is the first. And I think Kennedy is going to push for that. He's going to have some big fight. But I think this is one of the most important things for long-term human health going, which is why everything is sort of at the moment has been absolutely miserable. But I think him getting that position has given me hope that we might actually be able to achieve this goal.
So I'll be honest with you. I don't have that hope that you have. Having seen what's happened in the last few years, I think Bobby is not going to be able to change anything. I think the powers that be are either controlling him or they will neutralize him. I think we will have some token things like processed food and whatnot, and talk of looking at the childhood vaccines. But I think the lobby, the power groups, the technocrats, the oligarchs that Trump has surrounded himself with are going to push ahead with mRNA tech. And I hope I'm wrong. And let's see what happens.
Yeah,
but I don't believe in hope anymore.
Yeah, Well, I mean, my big worry was about Kennedy, that he wouldn't survive long enough to get this nomination because they are that ruthless. And so the fact he's got there, to me, is just a big sigh of relief that because Gates and the farmer did every trick in the book to prevent him getting in. He used every trick in the book, and he still got in. And I know that so have the people who want the messenger RNA, but at least there's two sides now.
Yeah.
And, I'm not going to give up, and neither are all the people. I mean, all the people in the People's Vaccine Inquiry, from the people involved in protection, like Nick Hunt, and then there's all my clinical colleagues who've amassed an unbelievable amount of evidence. Ross Jones, Claire Craig, and many, many others, Liz Evans and Jonathan Angus, the Dr. Barrister, etc. I mean, there's so many of them. I could go on and on. And that we're all working together, which I think is really good. And we're working with similar groups in Australia and New Zealand. So my way is you have to be hopeful, otherwise you just give up and not do anything, like most of the people I know who just don't do anything.
Okay.
I think we've got to keep this drive going, otherwise, what is the point?
Can I just talk about your book?
I need to actually go at the moment. I thought this was only going to be an hour.
Okay, very, very quickly. This. Thank you for your time. Your book, The Death of Science. I think it's brilliant in parts, but I know the focus is on political correctness and wokeism, but do you not think there's an element that science has been murdered by careerism in academia, and also the neoliberalist capitalist agenda and ideology, the powerful rich corporations corrupting everything? Do you not think that's a huge element to it as well? The death of science?
And I mean, the book has caused such a stir, and I'm fully aware of its deficiencies. And I mean, I started writing it, and I ended up being a co-editor of it. And I was really pleased that we were able to get Ross Jones and Claire to contribute the bits on the vaccines at the end. But it's now clear that it is it's nearly a subject in its own right, and we're going to do a second edition, which I think will be able to expand and include everything, because there was even discussion as to whether it should be called rechristened as the death of democracy. And I've said, well, the thing all goes together. It's a big loop. But actually, Jonathan Sumption has really coined that term, the death of democracy, with his writing. And the other thing is there's a whole load of deaths of this, that, and the other. I feel that we will stick to this title, The Death of Science, because that is the window which we look through and realise just how dreadful everything is. And the others to do Death of Democracy. I mean, apparently it's 2 or 3 books called that already. It starts with the rise and fall of the Third Reich. That's the death of democracy. And then Stalin. It's too big a subject. But we want to look through the death of science, which is being used as the age of enlightenment.
Well, it's being science is being used by the technocrats. That's the whole point. The technocrats are using science to get what they want. Anyway, and my last question of the day, before I ask that, can you please do an introduction to Richard Dearlove? I'd love to have him on the show talking about stuff, if that's all right.
Yeah, I can give you his contact. Okay, but I better go.
My last question, very quickly. You're on your deathbed. Before you pass away, your loved ones are all around you. What words of wisdom and guidance would you give your loved ones before you meet your maker?
Well, that's a very profound question.
It's my signature question now.
Right. I would basically, well, at the moment, I would just say, believe nothing, trust no one. I was brought up in an environment of trust, and I've just seen it was the nice thing to do, but it has just collapsed all around me. And I just want everyone to be on their guard, because what you're saying about this takeover and individuals just being no consequence, they need to be aware of that. And so many people are. Although I do believe the real young generation are really waking up. I'm really surprised that they're more reactionary than I was when I was reactionary. When I was, I've been in the world of far left academics for years. The universities and the academics in hospitals. This lot are no longer part of the far left. The wokeism has actually woken them all up. They're actually far more right wing than people were when I was growing up. And so I think that this reaction is something that could actually ultimately save us from the inevitable destruction, which will happen if we don't stop it.
I Ahmed Malik. I'm a private civilian protected by the Geneva Convention. My Substack, social media posts, and podcasts are my personal experiences, observations, and opinions. This information is for educational purposes only. Although I am a doctor, I am not your doctor, and I am not providing medical or legal advice to you or to the wider public. I am not licensed or registered with the GMC or any other licensing board. The responsibility for the interpretation, due diligence, and use of the information from my Substack and my podcast lies with you, the viewer and/or listener. Please do your research and use your discernment. It is not my intention to harass, intimidate, offend, defame, conspire, blackmail, coerce, or cause anxiety, alarm, or distress to any man or woman, and the information presented here is done so with peaceful and honourable intentions. Enjoy, folks.